I mean, could you, I don't know, because you've looked at a lot of these, is it sort of worth saying how much evidence do you need? You know, would it be possible to have, say, about 5 or 6 different pieces of work that would demonstrate all of these? Or
I suppose it's a bit difficult to do it like that, but it's when you talk about it, it sounds quite long, but it really isn't, because, say, the first section on knowledge really is certificated knowledge. So you have to have done some sort of course somewhere, some sort of training from which you have either a certificate and the outcomes or the content of the modules, and people just will go through things they've done and highlight, you know, they have a list of all the module outcomes on the model, and they'll just highlight with a highlighter knowledge of different levels of therapy, or knowledge of human development. It's not really a big issue, and that again they may be using the same certificated courses for the whole of that section.
Right.
Sometimes they might be using more than one course that they've done. With the skills, it's a mixture of some of it might be testimonial and some of it will actually be actual evidence. So for instance, if I have a role in which part of my role is to maintain and manage records, it will say that somewhere in the role description or job description, even if I work in a voluntary agency, that this is part of my role. So you would just put in a copy of the job description and highlight the appropriate sentence, or it might be in a testimonial and you'd highlight that bit of the testimonial for that section. Sometimes people put in anonymised letters and things, so they take any identifying criteria out, or identifying labels out, but actually would put in a letter or something like that. So it's difficult to say. We don't want huge amounts of evidence in each section, you know, just enough to satisfy what the criteria says, really. So there's no point in putting additional evidence in. We don't really want it. All we're checking is, do you have equivalence to core professional training? There is about, I suppose, each year, maybe, difficult to judge, I would say about 25% to 30% of the KSAs do get sent back to the candidates saying you've missed some of the evidence out, or you haven't got sufficient evidence in this section. But I think if you read it fairly carefully, because it tells you a minimum of 2 sets of evidence for each category. But generally, that's all that's necessary, 2 sets. Unfortunately, what you can't do is, if you've got a big hole in it somewhere, you can't substitute by putting 4 sets in section 8 and no sets in section 9. It doesn't work like that. You've actually got to have evidence for every section. But because most of this is on your already certificated learning, or work that you've actually done, or testimonials, it's really not that complicated to put together. I don't think. I should think you need a bit of forewarning, because when you're asking people in agencies to write a reference or a testimonial for you, sometimes those people are very busy and they can't do it on the spot, so you need to give them a couple of weeks' notice and to give them the grid so they know, in a sense, to focus what they're writing so it meets the criteria in the grid. But I myself think this could be probably done across the course of a week, or if you were doing it all at once, you could probably do it in a day if you were organised.
And then what happens to it when it comes into the university, does it?
Yeah, it comes into the university, and then the programme leader is asked to go and look at it. We get a notification saying the KSA for this candidate applicant is in. We go and look at it and just check that it meets the requirements. If it does, we would ask for the candidate to be interviewed, to be put on the list for interviews. And if it doesn't, we ask the admissions section to contact the candidate and say, there's a problem with this portfolio because it's too thin, i.e. not enough evidence, or more particularly, which is my preferred way of doing it, what you've submitted for Section 10 commitment to ethical principles is not adequate.
Yeah.
So, for instance, it wouldn't be adequate for a candidate to write, I work to ethical principles used by the BACP, because we only have the candidate's word for it. It needs somebody in a position of responsibility and authority to say that, or several people maybe to say that. So it's not enough to say, I have an awareness of risk. Either you would need somebody to say this person works the agency risk procedures and has had 2 days in agency training on working with vulnerable adults or working with vulnerable children. So it's the evidence needs to be of the right sort. So sometimes we'll write back to people and say, you need to change the nature of the evidence, or you haven't got enough evidence in this section.
Yeah, so in effect then, thinking about the sort of whole timeline for this, is it advisable, do you think, for students to submit, or candidates, to submit their application form first before going through the KSA?
Yeah, because the system we have at the moment is that we brief the admissions staff who accept most of the applicants, and the business unit is the other part. We brief them so they know what a list of core professionals look like. They have the list of core professionals up in front of them, so they can often tell when somebody applies whether they need to do the KSA route. And we'll just sometimes go straight back to the candidate and say you need to put in a KSA portfolio, in which case to send them out the KSA grid that we've been talking about and some instructions. There's a letter that's sent out to the candidate telling them how to do it. Sometimes we will get a call from admissions or an email saying, do you want to come and look at this application? Is it KSA or not? In which case the programme leader will go ahead and look at the application and make a decision about whether the candidate is KSA or not. So at that point then the KSA grid and letter, if it is KSA, is sent out to the applicant, and currently they've had a month to fill the KSA in, and then if the KSA comes back in acceptable form, they're put on the list for interview. If the KSA has some problem with it, they're given extra time to meet the deficit in the KSA, whatever that is. It may be that we might extend this month a little bit because it has caused some problems, particularly when you get round Easter or the summer, when people don't get the letter or the email because they've gone on holiday and therefore don't have the full month to do it. On the other hand, it's, from our point of view, the earlier we get applicants, partly because this is a lengthy-ish process for all candidates, not just the KSA candidates. The earlier applications come in, the easier it is.
Yeah, so I mean, that was the point that I was trying to help, and the reason for doing this podcast, as well as flagging this up for people early on, because in fact the people that are doing the advanced diploma would actually hopefully be in a very good position because they've been thinking about it now, and maybe be ready to submit the KSA in good time, because you start interviewing when, again, January
or February, and I think we finish earlier. In some years we've run it right through to July and August, and partly because of funding issues for applicants, but this has become just impractical. It's so complicated to be running things that late in the year, and again a lot of the candidates are on holiday. So we're hoping to, I think the last interviews will probably be, there'll be nothing later than July, I wouldn't have thought. Yeah. So really the sooner people apply, the better.
And it's usually one interview day a month?
Something like that, one day a month on average. It can be sometimes be a bit more flexible than that, but on average it's a day a month. And the candidates shouldn't panic if they don't immediately get an interview, because it just means they might be waiting for another 7 candidates to fill up the day before. We'll say, well, that's
full now.
That's full now, yeah. And we move on to the next day.
Okay. So thank you very much for going through all that this morning. I hope that it does help people. Also what I'll do to support this is put up a few key websites, such as making sure that people can get to BABCP and can see where the KSA is for themselves.
Yeah, I think if you look at the grid, it might help you, because I think when you listen to this, you might think, it still sounds horrendously complicated to me. But if you see the grid and the nature of the evidence that it asks for, which is on the website under accreditation and KSA, it actually really isn't that much work. You just need to be a bit organised. You do need to know what sort of certificated study you've done in the past and have some idea of where they learn the outcomes things are. And if you haven't got them, you sometimes have to go back. I've had to do this myself. For another reason, I'd go back to Birmingham University and say, what were the learning outcomes of this course? Because when I did that particular course, they didn't publish them.
Right, yeah.
To students, and I had to go back and say, well, what were they? And eventually, after a couple of weeks, they wrote back and said the learning outcomes were this. So sometimes you'll have to go back to get things, and that's why I say it needs a degree of organisation. But in terms of the quantity and difficulty of producing the evidence, is quite small.
Yeah. So, like I say, I hope it really helps. I'll put up with BABCP's web address again and a specific reference to the KSA. I might also set up a particular discussion forum on the module itself for people that want to perhaps support each other through doing the KSA, if that's the case, or in fact an application more generally, because a lot of what we said today, I think, is relevant to people that don't necessarily need to go through the KSA route, but would want to know what the application process is like.
Yeah, and finally, I think that sounds really good. I would like to reiterate, because I think it's so important, as a programme leader, I have no preference for core professionals over KSA candidates. Our clients don't appear to have any preference for core professionals over KSA candidates, and the outcomes of the students who finish the course shows no great difference between the two. So if you haven't got a core profession, it's important you don't let this put you off.
Right. Yes.
We welcome everybody, and people have come from incredibly diverse backgrounds. So we have our standard. We've had psychiatrists on courses, doctors of clinical psychology, learning disability nurses, RMNs, social workers, probation officers. I think we've had a GP or two. But we've also had merchant bankers, people who've come from advertising, people who've run their own businesses in industry, accountants. There really isn't any sort of background that's inappropriate per se.
Yeah.
It is about the things that we spoke about during this podcast.
Okay. Thank you very much, Margot.